Hi, class. So we're going to go back to Toni Morrison and recitative, and you're going to have your second paper on recitative. Now, I usually do close reading first, and then I do literary research or scholarship. And what defines a close reading or a purely literary analysis is that the only evidence that you have for making your argument is the text itself. With recitative, I'm realizing that it's actually really helpful to look at some outside sources. So I'm actually going to ask you to read a few things. The first is by Honorée Jeffers, and it's from the New York Times, and it's about a republication of recitative. And she makes an argument that I thought was very interesting that you couldn't really know without having lived through the 1980s, as Jeffers did. And what Jeffers says is that in the 1980s, there was this very strong idea that if a character wasn't marked as anything, that the character was white. That sort of there's this idea of a universal humanism, but in that universal humanism, it turns out that the universal human is kind of a white, straight dude. And if you're a woman, that's difference, right? If you're black, that's difference. If you're gay, that's difference. And so by writing recitative in a way that you didn't know who was being marked as different, it was actually asking white readers to think about their own whiteness in a way that was very unusual in the 1980s, but I think has become more common. I think that if you ask readers to think about their own whiteness now, or white readers to think about their own whiteness now, that we do this all the time. And, we have certain stereotypes, like the Karen, right? That's purely a white stereotype. And so I want you to read the Jeffers and annotate that. It's very short. It's from the New York Times. I want you to find something that you agree or disagree with and mark it, and something that you'd like more clarification on. Then you have two more articles, and these are longer, that are in course materials. One is by Zadie Smith. Zadie Smith, the Z and then the S is hard. Zadie Smith is a very important novelist. She was born and raised in England, and she came to the United States in the early 2000s. Her first novel, White Teeth, is a wonderful novel. I highly recommend it if you're looking for a novel. I know you're busy reading for classes. I know you don't have extra time, but it's a really good novel. And so she talks about how reading recitative asks the reader, and this is different from what Jeffers is saying, right? Jeffers is saying that in the 1980s, this asked a white reader to be like, oh, right, whiteness, I have something. I need to think about this as an identity. And Smith is saying that what it makes the reader do is think about how they understand race, right? That as a reader who's thinking which one is black and which one is white, it makes you think about your own understanding of how that's structured. The third article is by someone named Stanley, and she is really focused on Maggie, and she's actually doing a disability studies reading of the text, of the story, in which she's interested in the way in which Maggie, as someone who is physically disabled, they don't know exactly what her disabilities are, right? They have a discussion as to whether she can't speak or doesn't speak, whether she can't hear or doesn't respond. And Stanley's the last name, not the first name. Stanley talks about how Maggie kind of stands next to Twyla and Roberta. That Twyla and Roberta are sort of having their own hierarchies that have to do with class and race and gender, and that Maggie is oppressed due to disability, and the ways in which the able body, or the assumptions of able-bodiedness, function within the text to show the ways in which the suffering is a fractal, right? That anywhere you look, there's something going on. That if we get caught up in Roberta versus Twyla, we might also miss that their identity, right? If their identity is built on not being like the other because of race, both of them are able-bodied and then can look down on Maggie when they're children because they see her as being lesser because of her physical differences. And then as adults, kind of accuse each other of being bad because of the way they treated Maggie. So I want you to read these 3 articles. If the Smith or the Stanley are too long, only read one of them. I'll give you a quiz. I'm asking you to annotate the Jeffers, and then I'm asking you to take a quiz with either the Smith or the Stanley. And then for your paper, you will need to use the Morrison and at least one of those other sources. So using either the Jeffers or the Smith or the Stanley. You can use all 3 if you want to. You can use 2 of them, but you have to use at least one of the secondary sources. A secondary source is about a primary source. So like recitative is the primary source, that's the literary text, and then anything about that will be a secondary source. And the way I've structured the writing assignment is I've given you a thesis. And it says does not in the middle. So you can pick either side of the thesis. You can say that it does do this, or you can say it doesn't do that. Now, if you pick one of those ready-made theses out of the assignment, that's a B level. You need to have a thesis that's actually more nuanced than those things, which means you really need to agree and disagree. You need to say it's doing this more complicated thing. You have to build on the thesis. And that's a very hard thing to do. I'm asking you to do that when you're reading the articles. It's not simply to agree or disagree, but if disagreeing is easier because then you say, no, you're wrong and this is what I think. But if you agree, using that as a foundation to build on, right? That it's not enough to just say like, okay, yes, this is correct, but to actually say, and now that I know that this is correct, I can have this other thought that I built on top of it. So the paper is due this Sunday. That's a lot of work. I highly recommend that you work with a tutor in the Writing Center. They're very, very helpful. You can come to my office hours. I have office hours on Tuesday and Thursday from 1:30 to 2:30 on Zoom, or you can make an appointment to talk to me, and I will meet you on Zoom, and hopefully we can find a time. And keep up the good work. Just don't fall behind. And one more thing is that, or 2 more things. One is that you can rewrite your papers. When you turn in your paper, if you get below an A, I will give you things to do before you turn in the next draft, and you will get the higher grade. So if you follow those instructions and you turn it in again and you get a higher grade, you will only have the higher grade. So even if you turn in a C paper, you can get from a C paper to a B paper to an A paper, but if you never turn in a paper, you can't get any better, right? So make sure you turn something in so that I can give you guidance. And the other thing I want to say is that these articles are quite difficult. I think the Jeffers is the simplest, and then I think the Smith is a little bit harder, and then I think the Stanley is quite difficult. And as you're reading these, it's okay to feel a little bit confused. A lot of times we think we have to get everything right away, and if we understand it right away, then we're doing it right. But with literary analysis, it's often quite challenging. So if you think about the experience of reading recitative, where most people kind of think they know which one is, they know if Twyla is white or if Roberta is white, or if Twyla is black or if Roberta is black, and then the story kind of keeps like spinning you around. And that experience of not knowing, that experience of being confused, that experience of being like, wait, what? Like, wait, I thought I knew where I was, but now I don't, is really productive. That means you're doing it right. So if when you're reading through these articles, you find yourself kind of struggling, saying, I'm not sure what that means, saying, I might need to look up these words, like, I don't know what discursive means. And, either talking to a librarian or talking to me or or just looking it up on Wikipedia, that's a sign that you're doing it right. If you are struggling with these ideas, don't think that means that you're not succeeding. When you struggle with the ideas, that gets you to the other side where you have stronger and more deeply held convictions, and you can reach truly insightful conclusions. Okay. Next week we'll get back to Twelfth Night, but for now, focus on recitative, focus on these secondary sources. You may want to read recitative a second time, or a third time, or a fourth time, because as you keep going through it, you'll keep finding things that will be interesting and useful. And if you need help, I'm here. The Writing Center is here, and I will see you next week.